Neighbors, Fred McFreely Rogers was a television personality, a puppeteer, an educator, a Presbyterian minister, a composer and a songwriter, author and activist. He was most famous for creating the children's educational series, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Each episode began the same way, with Mr. Rogers coming into his home, taking off his coat, putting on his famous hand-knitted sweater and his sneakers. And then he always sang his theme song. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? And although he received numerous awards and accolades throughout his lifetime, he never considered himself to be a TV star. He always said that he was a neighbor who had just come for a visit. Mr. Rogers knew what it was to be a good neighbor. I shared Mr. Rogers' song and the story of the Good Samaritan during chapel time with the children of Crossroads Development Center. To reinforce the lesson of helping each other, we played a game in which one person would put on a Band-Aid on another. Now, I have to confess, I have some learning to do about talking to 2-year-olds effectively. They loved meeting the new person in their neighborhood, me, their new pastor, and they loved sharing their names with me. But they wouldn't put Band-Aids on each other. They gleefully stuck them all over their own bodies, but they had trouble understanding that another person could be hurt and needed a Band-Aid. Now, the 4-year-olds were happy to give and receive Band-Aids, but they preferred to stick them on their friends. The concept of sticking them on the next person in line, their neighbor, was a bit of a stretch for them. They really wanted to stick those Band-Aids on their friends. The 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and on, they grasped how to play that relay game quite quickly. They were all eager to give Band-Aids, but they were reluctant to accept this sign of help. And when this happened, we asked them just to shake hands with their neighbor and say, "God bless you," to teach them that not all hurts are visible. Sometimes when we are sad, when our hearts are wounded, rather than retreating from the world, we need to accept the help offered by a neighbor as a blessing from God. Although Jesus was talking to a crowd of adults and I was talking to a crowd of preschool children, we had similar challenges. Once Jesus was teaching when a lawyer interrupted him and asked, "What do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" Not missing a beat, Jesus replied, as he often does, with a question of his own. Asked, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer, who was not a lawyer in the sense of a criminal lawyer, but rather someone who was devoutly adherent to the Mosaic law, probably a Pharisee, someone who centered their life on religious piety and following the letter of those laws, answered by quoting the great Shema that you can find also in Deuteronomy. "You shall love your God out of all of your heart, with all of your soul, your strength, your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live," replied Jesus. But the lawyer wasn't satisfied. He was trying to discover if he had done enough of the right things to get into heaven, enough of the right prayers, enough of the right worship, and enough of the right works. Hoping to justify himself, he asked another question about the necessary limits to his love. And he asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Now, American writer and theologian Frederick Buechner suggests that the Pharisee was hoping that Jesus would answer with something like this: "Henceforth, a neighbor shall be defined as meaning a person of Jewish descent, whose legal residence is within a radius of not more than 3 miles from one's own legal residence." A neighbor. I fell into that same definition trap this week while researching Davidsonville's neighborhood. And I chose a 5-mile radius from the church for analysis. And now I learned a great deal about the economic, racial, and population patterns, the marital status and education levels, even the giving patterns and religious trends of the people within that 5-mile radius. And then I went with Vonda and packed 200 breakfasts for the Breakfast Club children who battle hunger in Lothian. And I went with Blair to learn about the work of the local Rotary Club. And I realized that this congregation serves far beyond a 5-mile radius with those whom you call neighbors. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan refused to set limits for who was in and who was out, and instead established a love ethic that has no limits. Jill Levine, a New Testament scholar, points out that the Hebrew word for neighbor and the Hebrew word for enemy share the same consonants in the same order. And in written Hebrew text, they don't use the vowels. So when Jesus asked the question, it was a much deeper question than we might suppose. When he asked, "What do you read there?" he meant, are you able to see the Torah's words, in those words, the command to love both your neighbor and those whom you would see as enemy? Let me say that again. The words printed in the Torah for neighbor and enemy would be the same. Are you able to see the command to love both your neighbor and your enemy? We live, as they did in the first century Palestine, with violence and fear. All the adults that I spoke to this week confessed that if they saw a man or woman lying beaten and blooded on the side of the road, their first gut reaction would be fear. With all that has been in the news lately, they hoped they would have the courage to walk straight into a situation like that and begin to minister to the person because they so badly wanted to identify with the Good Samaritan. But in truth, the compassion that they would feel for the injured person and the fear that they would feel for their own safety would vie for their initial response. On Tuesday, July the 5th, police responded to the reports of a man threatening people with a gun, and they wrestled a black man to the ground. And voices caught on cell phone video can be heard crying, "He's got a gun!" And then it appears that the police officer pulled out his gun, pointed at the man beneath him, and fired twice, killing Anton Sterling. On Wednesday, July the 6th, Philando Castile was pulled over while driving with a broken rear light. His girlfriend and her child were also in the car. Reportedly, he clearly told the officer that he was licensed to carry a concealed gun and had one in his possession. He was shot 4 times, reaching for his license and registration. A gun was removed from his pocket after he lay wounded and bleeding. His girlfriend released the cell phone video of the aftermath of the shooting. Hear me carefully. I am not condemning police officers. Their job is far too complex for me to make a statement. I don't know what went on before those video clips or after. However, I do know that these events ignited debate and demonstrations about the lethal force used by officers, particularly against African Americans. So on Thursday, as a peaceful protest drew to a close in Dallas, one in which the police and the population worked together, a sniper began to shoot police officers, killing 5 and injuring 7, making this the deadliest day in U.S. law enforcement since 9/11 in 2001. 2 civilians were also injured. The shooter told authorities that he was upset by recent police shootings and wanted to kill white people, especially white officers. Tuesday, Anton Sterling in Louisiana. Wednesday, Philando Castile in Minnesota. Thursday, 5 officers killed, 9 people injured, and 1 gunman dead in Texas. As Attorney General Loretta Lynch said on Friday, Americans across the country are feeling a sense of helplessness, uncertainty, and fear. But the answer must not be violence. As we stand on the edge of this dark abyss, are you able to love your neighbor and your enemy? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who lived and loved in a similar time of violence and fear, left us this message. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Into a story created for his Jewish audience, Jesus plopped an enemy and made him the loving, compassionate hero. He shook up their idea of who help would come from. He turned the lawyer's question upside down. The one you think is your enemy could turn out to be your friend and neighbor. Jesus encouraged us to see with eyes of faith, not eyes of fear. Eyes of fear see the differences between people. They see the risk of harm rather than the prospect for peace. Black and white, officer and civilian, citizen and migrant, Christian or one of another faith, we are all loved by God. And when any of us are hurt, God's heart is broken. We are called to be love and to love without limits. About 20 years ago, there was a KKK rally in Ann Arbor, Michigan. As you can imagine, this very liberal, progressive university town was not particularly welcoming to the Klan. And many, many protesters hit the street to make their displeasure known. The police lined the route, and a barrier was put up to separate the protesters from the marchers. The anti-Klan folk far outnumbered the Klansmen and their hangers-on. And in the midst of all these activities, one hanger-on, a man with a Confederate flag t-shirt and a Nazi SS tattoo, found himself on the wrong side of that barrier. He had stumbled into the midst of the protesters, and they turned on him. They started pushing and punching. He ran and they chased, and he fell and they pounced, and they began to strike him with the sticks of their placards. Amid the shouts of "Kill the Nazi," in the midst of all this confusion, a Samaritan showed up. Keisha Thomas, an 18-year-old black girl, leapt out from the crowd, spread herself over the man, and shouting out, "It isn't right! This isn't right!" And the sight of this fierce, insistent black teenager protecting a middle-aged racist man stopped the crowd in their tracks. And Keisha was not hurt, and the man himself got up and left without saying a word. But a year or so later, a young white man approached Keisha and hesitantly said, "Thank you. You saved my father's life." The Pharisee, questioning Jesus, was operating at a Sesame Street level, asking, "Who are the people in my neighborhood?" But Jesus' parable demands that we operate more like Mr. Rogers, by reaching out with a compassion to everyone we meet, asking, "Won't you please, please, won't you please be my neighbor?" Mr. Rogers, through his spirituality and calm nature, was able to reach out to our nation's children and encourage each of them to understand the important role they played in their family and in their community to shape the world that they lived in. Let us show that we have learned Christ's lesson too. Let us draw on the love given to us by Jesus to courageously respond to others, both our enemies and our neighbors. Amen.